Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Urban Farms, Commercial Farms or Socially Minded Operations. We have a great turnout and are so pleased you're able to join us. My name is Andy Pressman, and I'm an agriculture specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology, more commonly known as NCAT. NCAT is a nationwide nonprofit organization who works on issues pertaining to sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy, and sustainable communities. One of the sustainable agriculture programs that NCAT manages is the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, which is better known as ATRA. ATRA provides publications, technical assistance through our telephone hotlines and website, webinars, workshops and trainings, and other information to farmers, ranchers, educators, extension agents, and others involved in sustainable agriculture across the country. ATRA is funded through a cooperative agreement with the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service, and we are grateful for their support. Our presenter today is Dr. Carolyn Dimitri, who will be discussing the viability of commercial urban farming. In particular, she will be presenting an update on some of the research results from a national study of urban farms that looks to understand who urban farmers are, how profitable are urban farms, and what the challenges they are facing are. Dr. Dimitri's research, as well as today's webinar, is being funded by the USDA's National Institute for Food and Agriculture. Before we get started, I want to be sure to mention a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the ATRA website within the next few days. Second, as you're listening to today's webinar, please note that your microphones are muted. I also want to mention that you can type in any questions you have in the question pane you see on your screen for Dr. Dimitri to address with the remaining time we have at the end of the presentation. If we do come to the end of the hour and there are questions that have not been answered, Dr. Dimitri has kindly offered to stay on the line to continue answering some of the remaining questions. And if there are questions that she still does not get to, I will be collecting them so that one of the project partners can get back to you via email in the days to come. We always welcome your questions to ATRA as well. You're welcome to call our toll-free technical assistance line at 1-800-346-9140. We also invite you to go to our website at www.atra.ncat.org and click on the Ask an Ag Expert button to send us a question by email. We respond to all the questions we receive, and this service is offered free of charge. If you missed the number or website, please don't worry, as they will show up on the bottom of the presentation slides and at the end of the presentation as well. Also, before we begin, I just want to ask our viewers to take a few minutes to complete the survey for this webinar that will appear on your screen after you close the webinar. On that note, I want to thank you all for taking the time today to be a part of this webinar. As I mentioned, our presenter today is Dr. Carolyn Dimitri. Dr. Dimitri is an applied economist who studies food systems and food policy at New York University. Dr. Dimitri's research spans the wide range of work on different aspects of the food system. She is currently studying urban agriculture around the country, food access in the urban setting, and the political economies of the national organic regulation. She is recognized as the leading expert in the procurement and marketing of organic food and has published extensively on the distribution, processing, retailing, and consumption of organic food. For more than a decade, she worked as a research economist at the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She is currently an associate editor of the journal Renewable Agriculture and Food Systems and is a member of the scientific board of the Organic Center. Thank you, Dr. Dimitri, for being with us today, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Andy. As Andy mentioned, the research I'll be presenting today looks at urban farming around the United States. And I have two collaborators on this research project. One is Andy from NCAT, and the other is Lydia Oberholzer at Penn State University. And we were lucky enough to get funding to do this research from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. So before we start, I'd like to just make a few comments, and one is that this research is still in progress. We have many holes in our analysis, and we don't really have every detail nailed down, but this gives you the sense of how far we've come in our work. And another important thing to keep in mind is the research team has a long-standing interest in the farming sector, and our basic approach is really how farming systems in general can work for farmers. And at the root, that means, can farmers make a living by farming? So the basic premise of this research when we started was, can an urban farmer earn a living by farming in the city? Next. Well, as you probably know, urban agriculture holds many promises. People have said that urban agriculture can enhance food security by bringing food into neighborhoods where people have limited access, that urban agriculture can reduce urban blight. Urban agriculture can bring more green spaces into dense cities that are kind of concrete villages, like the one where I live. Urban agriculture is said to reduce food waste, increase property values, and be an important part of developing local and regional food systems. Many cities have food system plans that incorporate urban agriculture, and many food policy councils around the country have incorporated urban agriculture into their plans and their visions for their cities. So these are rather large promises, and one wonders if any particular system can meet all of these goals. Next. In that sense, the specific research questions that we've developed and some that we'll talk about today are, the first is really, how extensive is urban agriculture? Is there really a genuine growth in the number of urban farms around the US, or is urban agriculture still something people are just talking about? Who's farming in cities? How profitable are these farms? And are these urban farms a way for beginning farmers or existing farmers to expand their markets or develop new opportunities? Next. So before I get into our specific research, I would like to just give some context about how we view agriculture, how we view rural communities and cities. Because we've had this movement of agriculture going from the city out to the rural communities and back into the city in different waves over the 20th century. And if you go back to maybe the late 1800s, the early 1900s, before any of us were alive, we definitely had regional food systems. Food was grown around cities, it was brought to the cities, and we had not very well developed markets for food. But around the early 1900s, when transportation made it possible to ship food over long distances, we had this development of a true national market. And it was at this time that we saw fruit and vegetable production specializing on the West Coast or the Pacific Northwest, and grain production specializing in the middle portion of the country. But that said, even though there was this development of a national food market, even by 1940 in the census, there was a count of 260,000 urban farmers. It was still a small number out of 6 million total farms, but it was significant enough that the census actually mentioned how many people were farming in the city. And around the same time, there were these discussions in cities that echo some of the conversations that we're having today, where policies were being mulled over about how you could take empty urban land and return them to farm use, or actually bring them into farm use if they had never been farmed before. So this shows this interesting relationship between urban cities, rural communities, and food production. And over the last probably 30 years, I would say that we've developed this ethos about agrarianism in our world, specifically in the area of people who think about restructuring or reframing the food system. We hear cries to go back to the land. We hear calls that urban life is empty, the small-scale farmer is in jeopardy, being threatened by industrialization. And the people talking about these are very well-known agrarians and also philosophers. But I think at this point, this modern view really looks at agrarianism and agriculture as a rural event and not an urban event, which doesn't exactly echo what people were talking about earlier. Next. And if you take a look at the data from the census from 1900 until 2000, you can see this unlinking of agriculture and rural America. So this graph basically shows the share of the farm population, the share of the US population that is on a farm and the share that is in a rural area, and how they represent a portion of the overall population in the United States. So if you go to 1900, you see that almost 40% of the population lives on a farm and almost 60% lives in a rural area. If you come up to 2000, the other end of this chart, you see that, oh, even like less than 1% of the population lives on a farm, and a little bit more than 20% lives in the rural communities. Still, this disparity between the share of population on in the rural communities and the share on the farm shows that we don't really have this linking of rural communities and farms, on a one-to-one basis. Next. So along with the same time, we have these agrarian visions, this delinking of agriculture and the rural communities, but we're also getting this sense that this agrarian vision has many failures in it. It's very hard for farmers to get access to land. It's very expensive. Farmer debt burdens are very high. If you look over the 20th century, you see these definite periods where there are widespread bankruptcies in the farm sector. So farm viability has been a problem for farmers, well, I think as long as we've been farming in a commercial way in the United States. There's this discussion of the disappearing agriculture of the middle, which is that farm that sells between $250,000 and $500,000 of produce a year, where it's too big to reach the direct markets and too large to fit into the industrial scale distributions system that we have set up, and that makes people question where are these farms going, and fearing that they will disappear. We've talked about who owns the farmland, mainly white men, and as time goes on, as the men are dying, women are inheriting the farms, but it's still basically dominated by white people. And the other thing we worry about is our farmers are aging out of farming, and who's going to grow our food in the future. So this agrarian vision really is dependent upon a rural existence, not an urban existence, and it also shows that there are failures and flaws in our ways of thinking about farms and farming. Next. And at the same time, there's this resurgence of interest in food, and I see this in particular with my students at NYU, where there are definite ethics and morals about our food. People talk about social justice. We should pay fair wages to the people who grow our food and distribute our food and sell us our food. The environment is being damaged by the ways that we produce our food. We have unequal access to food, so there are cries for increased food justice by having a wider range of particularly fruits and vegetables available to people who have no access because supermarkets are really not available in their areas. And then we worry about farm viability and profitability, and you hear cries to support local farmers. So all of these are concepts that people are trying to bring into practice, and the practices that we see that demonstrate these concepts are young people wanting to farm. These are probably, many of my students, in fact, have grown up in the suburbs, and they've gone to very, well-heeled institutions, and they are giving up the corporate life in pursuit of farming. People are trying to farm in the city. People are trying to start food businesses that have social bases rather than profit bases. There are nonprofits that are trying to increase food access and regional food hubs. So these are all pieces of the how do you take this contemporary morality about food and bring it into practice? And so the research that we are doing is looking at one aspect, urban agriculture. Well, we started with it actually as one aspect, and as it turns out, where all of these other practices and concepts are starting to emerge through the work that we've been doing. Next. So we have some very sticky questions that we don't really have good answers to yet. And some of them might sound trivial, but I will put them in a larger context, and you'll see that people have been thinking about these questions for a long time. So the first very basic question is, what is urban agriculture? And you see this division when people talk about a community garden. Is a community garden a form of urban agriculture or not? Does urban agriculture actually have to take place in a city, or can an urban farm exist on the outskirts of a city? And how far away from a city does a farm have to be still be considered an urban farm? And then what is a farm? And so what is a farm? I guess it sounds like a very trivial question to ask, but in fact, the Census Bureau and the Department of Agriculture have struggled with how to define a farm since 1840, which was when they first started collecting data on agriculture in the United States. So in 1880, the language in the census said a farm is something that is not a potato patch or a family vegetable garden. In 1920, the definition changed a little bit, and it said that a farm was a plot of land that was 3 acres or larger, or a smaller plot of land that generated sales of $250 or more. And at some points in time, there was language that said something to the effect of, and provided the living for one man who worked the farm. So the current definition is that a farm is an entity that produces or sells or would have sold at least $1,000 worth of agricultural products during the year the census is conducted. So you can already see that that is not a huge amount of product. So a farm can be very small and still be considered a farm. So along those lines, we ask, do our urban farms have to produce food for sale? And do they have to actually make money from selling food? And these are sticky questions that actually we don't really have all the answers to yet. Next. So in order to address this, these basic questions, we took a three-pronged approach. We first started looking at census data. The second is a survey of urban and peri-urban farmers. So in our study, we defined an urban farm as a farm that was located in the urban core or in a county that abutted the urban core. And it could not, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. And then we interviewed urban farming stakeholders. So most of what I'll talk about today looks at these first two aspects, and we are in the process of finishing up our interviews, and I expect that we'll start analyzing that data in the near future. Next. So I'm going to start by talking about the work that we did with the census data. And we have a hypothesis about what we would expect to see from our census data. And one is, if there is significant growth in urban farming, that we'll be able to measure it through increases in the number of farms in urban areas. And also that we'll be able to see clusters of farms in these urban areas. So this type of question is actually pretty readily answered using census data. But we had some challenges. So the biggest challenge, I think, really is that when we did the analysis, we had to use data for 2007, that our 2012 data are not available. Actually, I think the census report said it's going to come out at the end of maybe this week or early next week. And so the timing of the data availability might actually have missed a lot of the increases in urban agriculture, because most of the discussion of urban agriculture, I think, has really started emerging in the past 5 years. So we might actually need to do one more year of data, which actually takes like 1.5 years to do. So I'm not sure, when that would actually happen, to see what we can find. And then the other question is a little bit more practical, in that how many urban farms are filling out census forms? It's not very clear. I've tried to reach out to the National Agricultural Statistics Service, but they were moving offices, so they were never really able to get back to me. So I'm not really sure how many of the urban farms, or farms in the urban core in particular, actually participate in the census, particularly those that have nonprofit status. Next. So the first approach is we've made a few maps to try to get a sense of what the distribution of farm operations and farmland looks like around the United States. So we started by looking at the 50 most populous MSAs, which are metropolitan statistical areas. And if you look at this map, you'll see those little black lines are outline the 50 largest MSAs in 2007. And so you can see pretty much where those big cities are. And then the map itself has the number of farm operations. So the lighter the yellow, the fewer the number of farms, and the darker the orange, the denser the number of farms. And so the first thing that if you try to look for overlaps between the number of farms and these MSAs, you don't really see all that many. There's a few in California, some in Texas and in Florida, but in general, there This map doesn't say, oh, there are lots and lots of farms in urban areas. In fact, it says the opposite, that most farms are in areas that are not densely populated. Next. So we decided at this point that we would look at regions that were thought to be friendly to urban agriculture. So we picked the Northeast. All of us live in the Northeast, so it also seemed like a logical next step. And we used this method called clustering, which is measured by this statistic called the local Moran's I, which talks about whether there's a statistical relationship of the presence of farms. So what we're specifically looking for is to see this HH, that dark black, would show that there is a density of statistically significant clusters of farms in a particular area. So this shows that you have outside of Philadelphia, there is a clustering of farms, which makes sense if you follow what's going on in the Northeast. Philadelphia has a very active food scene. And then a little bit around the area of Pittsburgh. But again, you don't really see a lot of evidence of, activity in the urban farming scene. So we thought, well, maybe we should take a look at products that farmers are likely to bring into cities. And those types of products tend to be high-valued products. Vegetables, goat cheese, goat milk are the ones that come to mind. And so we tried to look to see if we could find evidence of these farms. Next. Sorry about that, I jumped ahead. So we decided to go in a little bit deeper into the Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington MSA area. Let's see, can you go next again, please? Yep. And so this just takes one of, if you look at this little map up on the right is the Northeast. That little box shows where Stephanie, my co-author, zeroed in on an area. So she zeroed in on this Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington MSA area. So you can see outside of Baltimore and outside of Philadelphia, there is this very dense pocket of farms. And that shows also a little bit more activity around the Washington area. Next. So we next looked to see if we could identify clustering of vegetable farms in the Northeast. And so this was a little bit more promising. And we see in Buffalo, we detected some statistically significant pockets of vegetable farms, some outside of the Boston area, outside of Hartford, Connecticut, and again, the Baltimore, Philadelphia area. And if you map the anecdotal evidence with this map, we know that there are a lot of urban farms in Buffalo. There's plenty of discussion in Philadelphia, and Boston is also a market that is interested in having urban farms and a fair amount of local food. So when we look at vegetable farms, you can see more evidence of clustering. Next. Okay, so we also looked at trends in urban farmland, these land values. So we also speculated that if we have growth in a number of farms, that somehow it has to be related to the cost of farmland. So economic theory will tell us that farms generally are going to migrate, or land will migrate to its best use, the one that offers the greatest return. And in most parts of the country, especially near urban areas, that is residential development or commercial activity. So we did some basic statistical analysis that mapped the number of urban and peri-urban farms in an area with the price of land in that area. And I can send you a paper with this information if you're interested. But basically we found that if you look in 2007, the areas that have more expensive land have fewer farms. And so that's not a really gigantic surprise, and it was what we expected to find. But what we did find that was interesting was when we looked at the change in land use between 2002 and 2007, that if you looked at the areas with higher priced land, they actually had a greater increase in the number of farms, which I think does lend suggestive evidence towards growth in urban agriculture. Next. So our conclusions from the census data are that there's not a lot of, we can't really discern clusters of farms in urban areas, that there is some evidence of clustering of vegetable farms near some cities, and we found the same for goat farms. I can send you that research as well if you're interested, showing that these high-valued crops, that there are greater numbers of farms of these high-value crops around specific cities, and that this growth has happened in areas with high-valued land. So that's about as far as we could go with the census data. And as I said earlier, if we could look at this for one more year and bring in the 2012 data, we might be able to shed a little bit more light into this story. But for now, that's about as far as we can go. Next. So the next part of our study was basically to do a survey of farmers, urban farmers, and to see if we could assess the state of urban agriculture and try to understand who was farming and how profitable farming was. So we developed a 35-question survey, and it had 6 sections of information where we wanted to know what kind of production practices they used, how their businesses were organized, how they had access to their land, how profitable the farms were, farmer demographics, and the products grown. And I realized, actually, I left off all of the stuff that Andy works on, which is technical assistance that farmers need, and policy and obstacles towards development of urban farms. So we do have more information on that list than I just present there. So we developed our instrument in 2012. We pre-tested it with our advisory panel, which was made up of basically urban farmers and policy-minded people who worked in the nonprofit world, specifically relating to urban agriculture. So we used a snowball sample, basically because there is no list of all of the urban farms in the United States. So we contacted urban agriculture organizations, local groups that were interested in urban agriculture, some listservs that are commonly used for people who do this type of work. And we just sort of blitzed everyone and told them about the survey and asked them to pass it on to other people. And we put in incentives so that people would want to respond. So basically, we had a drawing at the end, and 10 people were selected to get a gift certificate of, I think, $75 for their response. So we had our survey out in the field for 3 months. So because of our study design, I would say that we probably have a fair amount of selection bias in who answered our survey. So I'm pretty confident in saying that what we find is probably not representative of all urban farms. But that said, I feel that, given the constraints and given the fact that there was no way to get a list that we could randomly sample, we did, I think, a pretty good job in advertising the survey and getting responses. Next. So we had 370 valid surveys returned. And as I mentioned earlier, this problem with community gardens and urban farms is kind of a tricky one to navigate. So we did actually want to exclude community gardens from our survey, but we wanted to make sure that we were making the decision and not the respondents. So we asked people specifically, are you a community garden or are you an urban farm? So we let people self-identify, and then we removed the community gardens data, and we'll analyze that data later, but we wanted to start with the urban and peri-urban farms. So of that, we had 315 completed surveys. And of these farms, oh, and just as an aside, there are 18,000 community gardens in the US. I thought that's a surprisingly large number. So as you see, we only got about 65 of them or 55 of them, depending upon how you do math. And so these surveys, of the farms that answered, they had an average of 3 farm locations, and 80% of them had at least one site in the urban core. So I feel like we did not get, we do have a good representation of, the classic urban farmer, of someone who farms in an urban setting. Next. And so we had here are the regions where our farms were located. And so as you can see, most were from the Northeast, about a third of them. And I don't know if that's because we advertise better in the Northeast or whether people in the Northeast are more interested in surveys or whether people in the Northeast, or there are more farms in the Northeast. But I probably won't ever know the answer to that. Okay, next. So our first research question is, what are urban farms like? And so again, here is it's tricky to decide how you're going to define your farms, and in particular the issue of small. What is a small farm? So currently the Department of Agriculture uses a metric of sales less than 250,000 as defining a small farm, and not a measure of size. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes to see why that makes sense. But we also wanted to know what they grow, and we also were curious as to whether they were farming organically. Next. So we actually decided to look at urban and peri-urban farms by size and also by sales. So in terms of acreage, you can see most of our farms are between 1 and 5 acres. So they're pretty small. And we have a few that are greater than 60 acres, which is pretty large for an urban farm. I'm suspecting that that is one that's in a peri-urban area. Next. So we next categorize the number of urban and peri-urban farms by sales. And again, this is more in keeping with what the Department of Agriculture does. And so you can see that the majority, almost 90, or a little bit more than 90% of our farms sold less than $10,000 worth of food in the year, which is really small. It's even smaller than you would think 1 to 5 acres would be. But I want to draw your attention to the larger farms, that we had some that were over $500,000 or even over $1 million in reported sales. And I think those tend to be these farms that are producing very high valued products like rooftop gardens or greenhouses that grow lettuce, the kind that you have packaged and sold in those clamshell packages in your grocery store. Those tend to be, they generate a lot of revenue because it's a high valued product and they can turn it over very quickly. But as you can see, that is not the dominant number of our farms, but we do have some of those have answered our surveys. And in fact, I think that is a pretty important component of urban agriculture. Next. And I wanted to show you some context for all U.S. farms for the year 2010, and to show you that what we found in terms of the urban farms, where we had a lot of farms that were very tiny. Here on our left side, we have the number of farms, and this last column is small family farms, and you see that close to 90% of all of the farms in the U.S. are small family farms. And the large family farms, which are over on under this value of production over on the left side, they have a disproportionate amount of the value of output. So basically, we have a few farms that are very large that grow a lot of food, and then we have a lot of little farms that do not grow tons and tons of food. And so I think our urban farms are very consistent with farms across all farm types in the U.S. Next. And our urban and peri-urban farms grow mainly fresh vegetables, and that makes sense for many reasons. It's easier to grow fresh vegetables on small amounts of land. A lot of the urban farms, as we'll see later, are interested in teaching people about eating healthfully, and so vegetables are consistent with that. So would be fruit, but I think it's harder to grow fruit in a city. And also, if you're direct marketing, that tends to be a very high valued product, which is often fresh vegetables. So, I mean, I think everything that we've found to this point is very consistent with what we would expect to find. Next. So the organic status of urban and peri-urban farms. One reason why we thought to inquire about how many farms are organic is if we go back to why people are participating in, I'll call it the food movement, but why people are trying these new forms of agriculture, often it's to preserve for environmental reasons, like to increase the health of the ecosystem. And I know this is a topic of debate, and I hear it with my students in class all the time. In my view, the only label that we have that can talk about how environmentally sustainable a production system is the organic label. And so the regulation for organic if you sell less than $5,000 of product in a year and you adhere to all of the rules of the National Organic Program, you can call your product organic and you can be exempt from certification. So that is what this exempt category is, of 28%. And so we had 8% of our farms that were certified organic. So at first I thought, oh, this is much lower than I expected. But then I thought I would check across the US and see how many farms are organic. And actually less than 1% of the farms around the US are organic. So this is a much higher rate, especially if you count the exempt farmers into this category. Next. Okay, so this brings me to my next research question, which is, are urban farms commercial operations? Are they nonprofit entities? Are they socially minded operations? And does it really matter? Next. So one metric that we thought of using to see what the mission of a farm is, and we used several different metrics, but this was one, was to see how much of their production was sold and how much of it was donated. And in our minds, the more that is donated, the more of a social mission the firm has, and the more that is sold, the more of a profit motive a firm has. So this pie chart shows the percentage of sales that were of the product that was sold. So whatever wasn't sold obviously is donated. So if you look at this 100% wedge, 20% of our farms sold everything, and another 46% sold between 90 to 99%. So if you come to the other side and you look at who sold less than 55%, that was about 13% of our farms. So from that metric, it seems that most of the farms that we are working with or that answered our survey were definitely interested in the profit aspect of running a farm. I'm not saying that my interpretations are right, but that's kind of where my mind is going. So that brings me to this concept that economists often talk about, which is, how does a farm or a firm organize? Because when you actually set up your business, you have to either be a nonprofit entity or a commercial entity. And there are there are legal ramifications for what you can do with your profits. But the economic theory tells us that, both of these firm types or farm types use inputs, basically the same inputs, right? Labor, land, seed, water, and whatever else they use to grow their agricultural products, and they produce goods and services. And so there is this stream of literature that really tries to sort out, like, when will a farm or a firm be nonprofit and when will it be commercial? And in some cases they talk about there could be a public good or like something that is altruistic, kind of like increased food access. And since it's not happening on its own, that maybe a nonprofit or a socially minded commercial operation can make this one of the principles of bringing something that the market, absent these altruistic goals, will bring into practice. So what we really see is this blending of social goals and business motives that it's hard to sort out the reasons for why people do what they do, but what we have found is a blurred line between nonprofit and for-profit in this particular case. Next. So looking at the farmers who answered our survey, 34%, this kind of orangish piece of the pie chart, were nonprofits, and all of the others are some form of commercial operation. So we have so about a third of our farms basically are nonprofits. Next. But we do see, the other thing we asked in our efforts to try to understand this profit versus social goal was, we asked people to give their mission statements, because often people will write a whole lot and then we can look at it and try to interpret it. So I would say for the for-profit farms, very few, maybe 3 or 4, just wrote that they were there to make money. Pretty much every other farm either talked about building community, promoting sustainability, and they were very fuzzy about what kind of sustainability, but it was definitely sustainability without environmental or economic, just sustainability. And many were interested in local. But the nonprofit farms did not really talk about community building and sustainability in the same way, but they had these more concrete statements like, we are here for food access, we are here to increase people's understanding of a healthy diet, or teaching them about farming. Something was that you could actually put into the category of being an educational facility. And interestingly, regardless of whether they were for-profit or nonprofit, many of them talked about how tasty their food was, and that was a very important part of their farming. Next. So who are the urban farmers? Next. We tried to look at the urban farmer in several different ways. So one is just the demographics of the farmer. So here, actually for most of the rest of the statistics that I'll show, or the findings of our survey, I have broken it down into commercial or nonprofit to see if we can see any differences in, who's engaging in these activities. So the age, you can see that the commercial farmers are older. They've been farming for more years, and they're pretty much equally likely to be male or female, and they're mainly white. Next. And where the farmer learned to farm, this kind of ties us back to this notion of, are people becoming urban farmers because they are wanting to actually produce food? And it ties into this question of whether urban farms are a place for new and beginning farmers to start farming in a way that will make it possible for them to earn a living. So, and these results were a little bit surprising to me, that the nonprofits were more, people who worked on a nonprofit farm were more likely to learn from their family. Because in my mind, I don't see, there's that legend or what people talk about, like people are not learning how to farm from their families any longer because so many people are leaving the farm. So I found that interesting. And if you go to the mentor, which is the second from the bottom, commercial farmers were more likely to have mentors on the farm, and there was not such a huge difference between apprenticeship or university programs. Next. So this question of who is farming also brings us to this next question, which I think might be the bigger and the more important question, and that is, what contributes to viability of urban farms? Are they viable, and what kind of quality of life do the urban farmers have? Next. So the viability of urban farms we looked at in several different ways. So the first is we just tried to take a look at the farm itself. What can we say about the farm? So here I present information for all farms, and then I break it down by nonprofit farms and commercial farms, and just to see how long they've been in, have these different metrics. So commercial farms have been in business longer than the nonprofit farms. And if you look at the second line, their annual sales are greater, and they donate less of their product. And excuse me, those are all statistically significant. Now, the other interesting part was how they viewed profitability. So if you look at this bottom line, where we asked them, we basically asked, is profitability a problem for you? And then we asked them to respond on a not a problem all the way up to extremely challenging scale. So for the farmers that report that, the commercial farmers were more likely to say that profitability wasn't a problem. And those were statistically significantly different. And interestingly, the other end, where profitability was very challenging or extremely challenging, we found no statistical difference between nonprofits and commercial farms, but we still see that about 40% of farms overall were reporting that it was very difficult for them to be profitable. Actually, that they technically said it was very or extremely challenging to be profitable. Next. And then, aside from the farm being able to be viable, the question is, can the farmer earn a living from farming? And so, I mean, as we all know, this notion of earning a living from farming is very complicated, and many farmers work off farm Many farm households have people who, one person works on the farm and someone who works off the farm. And, you know, there aren't any easy answers as to what is right and, you know, like, or how we should even think about this, except we know it's kind of easy to ask, can you make a living from farming? So here we asked for the commercial and nonprofit, how many earned a living from farming and how many did not earn a living from the farm? So if you look at this top line, 81 of the people said that they earned a living from farming, and 159 said they did not earn a living from farming. And so some people actually just didn't answer this question, which is why it sums up to less than 315. So I guess that's not so surprising, right? Because a lot of more farmers don't earn their living from the farm than who do earn their living from the farm. But now if we break into this commercial versus nonprofit measure, you can see that more of the commercial farmers earned a living from farming. Well, I should have put that in percents as I look at it. 51 out of 81, and then 121 out of 159 did not earn a living from farming. So let's move on to the next slide, and I have a little bit more to say about this. The sense of where farmer income comes from. Farmers struggle to make money partly because they have to grow their product, they have to face all the risks of production, and then they have to take it to the market and sell it. And what they're going to get for their product is largely unknown until they actually are selling their products. So here, commercial farms make most of their money from selling their products and from off-farm income. And if you look in the nonprofit world, most of the money comes from fundraising and not from selling or from off-farm income. So we could argue that the act of selling products has just been translated into having to raise money for your farm through this nonprofit organization. Next. And so the last question that we ask, well, it's not the last one, the last one that kind of ties into this, and it's what kind of labor is used on the farm. And there's a specific reason why we're interested in this. We know that farmers have a really hard time finding people to work on their farm. The labor needs definitely escalate at certain times of the year when you're transplanting seedlings and when you're harvesting. So both types of farms, commercial farms and nonprofit farms, have primary farmers who do most of the farming. And then if you look at the next line, farm workers, by which we mean people who are hired to work on the farms, about half of all farms are using farm workers. But when you come to the nonprofits, you see a lot of them are relying on apprentices or interns, almost 70%, and about 90% are relying upon volunteers. So this, again, ties into that question of the viability of a farm and who's making money, and can the farmer earn a living? Well, here it seems that for nonprofit farms, the farmers are able to make a living, but a lot of that is done probably because they have a lot of unpaid labor helping them. Now, I know people who run urban farms say that often the apprentices or interns or volunteers don't actually provide labor, that sometimes it's more of a mentoring process and they don't add, they add more work rather than productivity. But I'm not a farmer, so I don't really know the answer to that question. It probably depends upon whether your volunteer is regular and where you live and how many volunteers or interns you have. And also that concept of using unpaid labor has come under target. And if you are interested, you can either email me or you could ask me afterwards. You know, there are issues about when you're allowed to do that and when you're not. Next. So I guess, like, in wrapping up, there's a few things I would like to say. That in some ways, there are many common features between an urban farm, an urban/, peri-urban farm, and the rural farms that we're accustomed to thinking about. You know, it's a business. You're running a business. You have to worry about earning a profit and remaining viable. You have to still struggle with identifying markets. And there is still this reliance on off-farm income. And you still have a lot of white people running all of these farms. And then in the nonprofit, we have this fundraising versus commercial farms that have to worry about access to market, but it's still getting revenues is a very important part of maintaining your farm operation. Next. The differences, though, if you compare your urban farmers, they're much younger. If the average farmer across all of U.S. agriculture is 57, and the urban farmers are somewhere in that range of 39 to 46, depending upon whether you're talking about a nonprofit or a for-profit farmer. The urban farmers tend to grow vegetables, whereas the rural farmers tend to grow grains, oil seeds, or livestock. The urban farmers have been farming for fewer years, and they are more likely to have a farmer's market as a main market. Now, these are characteristics that are very common with farms that are in the rural-urban interface or farms that directly market to consumers. Next. So that kind of brings us back to one of our original questions, which is, what is the purpose of an urban farm? Is an urban farm, do they exist to meet social goals, or do they exist to provide food, or some combination of both? And when you think of this growth in urban farms, along with this growth and interest in how agriculture is related to environmental sustainability, food access, you wonder about whether the purpose of these farms is really to provide food to people, or is it producing some other good, like the production of knowledge about agriculture or the production of knowledge about farming, or drawing attention to some aspect of farming that we typically don't think about. In the end, I think that the urban farms face the same pressure as all other farms, and if we want to think about their role in the food system as we go ahead, it's not really clear, at least based upon the analysis of the data we've collected so far, it's not really clear where they're going to fit into the food system, whether they'll become an entity that produces food, or whether it will morph into these smaller operations that are producing knowledge about food rather than something to eat. So that, and then I guess maybe it doesn't really matter. I'm not sure if we care what the purpose of an urban farm is or not, but I'm struggling with that. Maybe you can tell. So that's pretty much all I have to say now, and I think Andy was going to open up the floor to questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Dimitri, and we have gotten some really great questions that we'll be going through here shortly. But before we begin with the Q&A, please note that Dr. Dimitri is willing to stay on the line after the hour is up to continue answering some questions. I do understand that folks may have to sign off, and so I want to mention a few quick reminders. First, this webinar will be posted in the next few days on the ATRA website at www.atra.ncat.org. Once again, we will get back to you about any questions you have that weren't answered during the webinar. And if other questions occur to you, please either call our ATRA hotline or use the Ask an Ag Expert function on the ATRA website. And remember that the hotlines and Ask an Ag Expert are free services that are always available for your questions about sustainable agriculture. One final reminder is to please take a few minutes to complete the survey you'll see on your screen immediately after you close the webinar. And a big thanks to Dr. Dimitri and to all of you for attending today's webinar. And I think we can start with a couple questions here. And I will say that we have received several questions about the report from this research, as well as the papers that you mentioned, Dr. Dimitri. Okay. And I think one option is we can post the papers along with the recording on the ATRA website, but we also have access to everyone's email address here from registering for the webinar, so we can send that out as well to everyone. And the report will not come out for quite a few more months, but once it does, we will be announcing it as well and posting it. But it is not available at this time. So, in looking at some of these questions here, one of the beginning slides you had mentioned that there in the 1940 census there were 260,000 urban farms, and yes. Someone is asking if that means commercial urban farms.
It would be whatever the definition of an urban farm, a farm was in the US in 1940, which was 3 acres. Wait, I have it right here. It's not clear if the census makes a distinction between like a nonprofit or commercial, but they would not be food. Those are not farms where food is grown for home consumption. How's that? I don't know if that answers the person's question.
Okay, well, we'll see if they have a follow-up. The next question is, and I can help you here, but I'll let you take a stab at it. How does the IRS define a farm?
Oh, I don't know. I only know about the Census of Agriculture. So Andy, feel free to answer that.
All right. Well, my understanding is the IRS defines it as 2/3 of your reported income must come from the farm. So hopefully that answers that question. Someone I think joined late here, but asked about the definition of a farm. Doesn't it include the intent to make a profit, which I believe you had stated?
Yeah, it does. The definition of a farm is an entity that produces and sells or would have sold at least $1,000 worth of agricultural products during the year the census is conducted. That's the technical definition. So I don't think it has anything to do with making a profit, because I think often those farms operate at a loss.
Okay. So here's sort of a different type of question, but I think is important as well, especially for those living in the Northeast who have been dealing with this. But the question is, could GMO labeling create a marketing advantage for small and independent producers, particularly in the urban setting?
Like GM free? Sure, I think so. I guess I'm thinking that the GM is more of a problem. I could be wrong about this, but it's more of a problem with packaged goods, and I think most urban farms sell fresh produce, and I don't know how pervasive GM products are in the vegetable category.
Uh-huh. And I will just add on that note that Vermont has just passed a GMO labeling law, and Connecticut and Maine had also passed one. However, it was dependent on New Hampshire as well as Massachusetts, and unfortunately New Hampshire did not pass a GMO labeling law. So it looks like Maine and Connecticut will not be adhering to their law as well. Let's see, Marissa in Pittsburgh had asked if the report will show specific number of responses particular to the individual cities that the research has taken place.
If we can do it with a way that protects the confidentiality of our respondents, yes, but if we can't, we might have to stick to region. So I mean, I think confidentiality is important here, because we promised when people filled out the survey that no one would be able to identify them from their answers.
Uh-huh. Okay, and someone also had asked if you can restate the number of community gardens in the U.S.
18,000 is the last statistics I saw.
Uh-huh. And I believe that's also available and stated at the American Community Gardening Association website.
Right. In fact, that's probably where I got it.
All right. You had a slide, number 33, that was showing the number of farms that learned from family members, particularly nonprofits, was high.
Yes.
And someone is asking do you believe that they learned more gardening aspects from their family as opposed to actual farming?
It's possible. We basically asked people, where did you learn to farm? And we didn't say not gardening, farming. So that's one of the questions. It's hard to know how people answered it, what they were thinking, but we specifically said, where did you learn to farm?
All right. Someone is asking here, what constitutes off-farm income?
Oh, I think well, again, we ask people to self-identify or to identify. So it would be off-farm income would be money that you make doing something that is not farming. So if you had a job at, Wegmans, that would be off-farm income, or NYU.
And another question here is, why were commercially run operations compared to nonprofit farms? I don't know if you can
Oh,
elaborate on that.
sure. I mean, basically because you observe that urban farms often are nonprofit entities, in particular in New York City. And the question was why? Why were why does a nonprofit urban farm exist anyway? So because their stated goal is not necessarily, making money. They have these other missions, and there's this different type of legal structure. So I guess the question deep down is, are the nonprofit urban farms, do they behave in exactly the same way that commercial urban farms do? And if they differ, it was important to try to understand, how they differ. So I think in understanding it, remember when we started this study, of course Andy will remember, but the person in the audience won't remember, we were specifically interested in, is this a way that farmers can earn a living? Could like a rural farmer expand by opening up an urban farm? Can a new farmer farm? And in the back of our minds, we were really thinking of farming as a way to produce food, not necessarily farming as a way to produce, knowledge about food or educational opportunities. And so at one point, it became very clear that there were plenty of nonprofit farms. And so one option would be just not to look at them. The other option would be to analyze all the data together, but then we'd be basically assuming they behaved in the same way, or to separate them. And I think we found some pretty interesting differences between the nonprofit farm and the commercial farm.
All right, thank you. And we got quite a few coming in, so I'm going to start reading them as they come in. Not sure we can answer this one, but do you think the same results might apply in Canada?
Why not? I mean, I would think that Canada and the US are more alike than they are different. So I would think they'd be pretty similar. But I wouldn't say that for sure, but that would be my guess.
Uh-huh. Quite a few successful urban farmers in Canada, and they're doing a great job. Here's one. Did you track the size of the operations and compare them to gross revenue? For instance, did half-acre plots seem to have any similarity in gross revenue?
Well, that's our next level of analysis. So that's on our to-do list. We haven't done it yet.
Uh-huh. And not sure I'm understanding this one, but someone is asking about the social differences in value of food. For example, France versus the US.
Are you one of my students? I have to laugh because this is a common question that my students think about. And I'm not really sure exactly how this relates, because that's more on the consumer side, right? I guess it's thought that some countries have these cultural heritage and they love their food more than Americans do because we eat so much packaged food. I'm not really sure how that would play out, in a study of urban farming, except to say that I think one reason for a lot of the nonprofit educational farms to exist, especially those that work with children, is to teach them about this element of food that is tasty and to get them maybe more actively engaged in food, like food growing and food preparation, and learning to love their food for just the beauty of it and the tastiness of it that you get when you get food fresh from the farm.
All right. This one is coming from Zach in Georgia, and I'm sort of going to rephrase here, and I can also help address this after the webinar through ATRA as well, Zach. But Zach has an agriculture business, organic composting business, and he's wondering, how do you engage and get involved with your urban farming movement? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, Andy, you can answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and a lot of marketing techniques too, but I think that one, Zach, we can best save. If you want to contact me after, I can help you navigate through that as well. Here's a question related to the survey. and that is how many languages was the survey translated into?
Oh, yeah, we just did it in English. Yeah, I mean, I guess we could have done it in Spanish as well, but actually, I didn't think of it until right now. So it's just an English survey.
And they're actually connecting here from Minneapolis, and looks like they're focusing on Hmong citizens and Hmong communities.
Oh, uh-huh.
Which I should also add that several of our ATRA publications are available in Hmong and Spanish as well, and we do have a Spanish hotline as well to the English. Here's someone asking if we can sort of describe more of the interview process that you sort of outlined the scope of the national survey, but perhaps you can maybe focus on some of the 15 cities we focused on and what those surveys looked like.
Sure. So and that's actually in progress right now, so that's why we haven't reported on it yet. But we basically identified stakeholders in each of the 15 cities, either urban farmers, people that were involved at the policy level or the city level that could either facilitate or impede the development of urban farming, and talked to people to try to understand what they saw as the opportunities for urban agriculture in their community, what were the benefits of urban agriculture, what were the problems that they faced. And so actually one of my graduate students who worked on a paper with the maps with me, Stephanie Rogas, will probably start working on analyzing that qualitative survey data this summer and starting to write up a paper on that. So that look maybe another 6 months, because analyzing interviews from 15 cities, I think 10 people in each city, is a pretty time-consuming process.
All right, well, the next question is from Jeremy, and he is wondering about the legality of volunteer farm labor, which is a loaded question, but in particular, he's wondering about the context of a summer internship program for youth.
Okay, so I think that there are very specific regulations about when you can use volunteer labor and when you can't. So first, I think you have to be a nonprofit organization to be able to hire volunteer or not hire, but to allow volunteer farm laborers to work on your farm. And it also has to represent an educational opportunity, so that it can't really be something like you're working for free and in return, you're not getting anything. You're not getting money, you're just getting experience. Now, this is a really complicated topic, and in fact, Washington State just passed a bill they passed a law, creating an intern program that basically allows commercial farms that are of a certain size to hire interns or unpaid labor. And there's a limit. They can have like no more than 3 interns at a time. And the argument, I think, is that this is a way to transfer knowledge about farming from farmers to young people who might be the future farmers. So, I mean, I think it's complicated. I know that often students at NYU want to get academic credit for working on the farm, and that's one way that these arrangements take place. So I think you have to be careful about how you do it to try to make sure you're abiding with the letter of the law. But I mean, that aside, I have a few thoughts about using volunteer labor in general. So one is, we are trying to improve the sustainability of farming. And so using people who don't get paid for what they do doesn't seem necessarily in keeping with sustainability of farming. But on the same time, is often these people that are operating small farms are working with very small profit margins, and paying people is very difficult. So I think it's a really complicated question no matter how you cut it. And there are cases where I think people actually have very positive experiences if they can find, a really good mentor. I've had students that have really learned a lot about farming and have been able to start their own farms based upon their experiences. But so everything is a double-edged sword, I guess, and complicated and tricky. So that's a really good question, and it's a very timely question. And I don't know exactly where we're going to end up on that question, 5 years from now.
All right, thank you. Here's sort of another loaded question that I know through ACHA we can provide some additional information, but this person is wondering if you have any information regarding the profitability and use of aquaponics and hydroponic systems, perhaps related to our research as well.
I think that is something I would defer to Andy on. I am not as familiar with like the nuts and bolts of aquaponic systems, so I don't know. That would be my answer. Ask Andy.
Okay, and I have your email here. I can definitely get you some statistics and information because aquaponics and hydroponics is a fastly growing sector within particularly urban agriculture.
Yeah.
Here's a zoning question. Do you have any data on the number and profitability of commercial urban farms correlated with the absence or presence of local zoning codes? And what places have the most favorable zoning codes?
Yeah, that I don't know, but that is something that we'll be exploring in the next level of our research, because we don't ask people to report what their zoning codes are, but we have asked people to talk about their issues with zoning and different regulatory barriers that or rules that a jurisdiction might put in place. And so our next step of looking at the profitability, we'll look at it more deeply, and we'll bring in that context of how does zoning work with it. I mean, I think people have done case studies and people have looked at different areas, but I think that one thing that we get from our survey that other studies don't have is we do have this national view, and we do have like more detailed data. So again, that's something that's on the next 6-month horizon for us to be working on. So you can keep in touch with either ATRA, Andy, or with me, and we can definitely keep you in the loop with that type of analysis.
Absolutely, and just to add on the level of case studies done, there's some remarkable stories out there. Particularly, I'm thinking of Kansas City, Cleveland, just have done an excellent job of sort of paving the way for zoning codes in favor of urban agriculture.
Yeah, Buffalo too.
Buffalo, yep. Okay, so here's a question from Paige wondering, how does the income and or production compare between urban farmers earning a living solely from farming and those with a second occupation?
Oh, yeah. I don't know, but that's on our to-do list also. Like, as I said at the beginning, this is a work in progress, so we will be doing that analysis as well. The whole issue of, the detailed profitability is the next up for me anyway.
All right, here's a question I'm not sure we can answer, but Gary's wondering if the new medical marijuana operations might change the picture for urban farmers.
Well, I actually have a little anecdote about that. So I know of someone who's I heard this secondhand, that there is an organic farmer in the state of Colorado that was actually trying to find a warehouse facility in Denver, and he'd been priced out of the market because of the medical marijuana operations. So I actually think it's probably not a good thing in those cities unless your urban product is medical marijuana, because it's just changed the cost structures. It's escalated the cost greatly. And I think since urban farming is not the most, it's not like a big money maker in general. If you look at the people who answered our survey, where you saw 90% of the farms made less than $10,000 a year, if your cost of land or facilities goes up greatly, I think that will make it harder and harder for you to make a profit.
Okay, here's another labor question, which is also a loaded question, which I think we can explore after this as well. But are there any specific regulations for having volunteer labor on a commercial urban farm?
Well, from what I understand, I don't think that you're really allowed to do that. So I don't know how, in what capacity you can do that, but I think that if you are a commercial urban farm or any kind of commercial farm and you have a volunteer labor person, that technically I believe you're in violation of the law. But I do think that ATRA has a really nice publication on having to do with laws and farms, which probably will just apply over to urban farms.
And I would add also, I think that's site specific or state specific, as I know Kansas City and their quest to implement urban farming laws and regulations dealt a lot with the labor issue. Here's a question I know we asked in the survey, but I don't think we mentioned today, is any idea of what % of urban farmers own their land?
Oh, yeah. I don't have that number offhand. But we did ask it. So again, actually, if someone wants to just email me, that person wants to email me, I can answer that question.
Okay, and here's, I think, a sort of a similar response, but here's a person asking if we are aware of or collected any information regarding folks who are certified naturally grown as an alternative to organic.
Nope, nope, nope. We only asked about certified organic. Knowing that there are people that don't like that concept, but I personally don't have the problems that other people have with certified organic.
Okay, and here's another question I know that we could put in the final report, but I'm not sure you may have at this time, but how many socially disadvantaged farmers participating, well, this is a little bit different, but in USDA loan programs are represented in this urban farm research?
Oh, I don't think we have any way of answering that question.
Yeah, the loan program part.
Yeah, or even socially disadvantaged. I don't think we really asked anything in that regard.
Okay, this may relate more to a USDA definition, but here's a question from Sean wondering, does off-farm income in our survey include value-added goods and services such as tree planting by a nursery or canning? What is your definition of off-farm income?
We just said off-farm income. We didn't give very specific definitions, but I would think our farms could have been growing nursery products. It didn't necessarily have to be food. And I would think a farmer would probably answer that a value-added product was a product of their farm and would not be off-farm. That would be how I would interpret the question if I asked it. Off-farm income is, I think, generally understood to be money that you make working on something that's not related to your particular farm. So if you're making jam from your farm, that would be a value-added product. And I think we did actually specifically ask people about their production of value-added products.
Okay. Here's, let's see if I can get back to it. Gary is asking, are the younger people coming into urban agriculture more female than the national average?
Well, it's hard to, yes, because all of the people coming into urban agriculture are younger than the national average. And also the farmers that are, urban farmers are equally likely to be men or women. And if you forget about the men dying off and leaving their farms to their wives, typically more farmers are men than women across all of the U.S. Was that clear?
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Andy.
Here's, I'll mention this question, but it could be another one that I'd be happy to address after the presentation as well for Richard. I was wondering, do you have a sense of the evolution of urban farming?
Well, I don't have a sense any more than anyone else does. This study really just looks at a point in time, and we have no way of really tracking how things have changed. That's the problem when you do a project that's called like the state of urban farming. Usually you do that because people haven't really looked at it to try to get a baseline before. I mean, I think, you know, the census data and the work that we've done that shows how the number of farms have changed in the MSAs is a little bit indicative of what's going on, but it's not really, doesn't give quite as much detail as this particular study has done.
Uh-huh. And I would just add to that that there is a connection with urban agriculture and this idea of small scale intensive farming and season extension as well that dates back centuries.
Right.
Although in our culture we're most affiliated with it coming out of Europe not too long ago, but perhaps the story of Paris is very highly known within urban farming, and I'd be happy to share that with folks after as well. Here's a question. Can you restate the waiver about small-scale farming and organic certification? Are there any other middle-of-the-road certifications that are easier or more inexpensive to obtain?
Okay, so the waiver basically is if you use organic farming methods as specified by the National Organic Program and the regulation, and you sell less than $5,000 worth of product in a year, you can call your product organic and not get certified. You're considered an exempt farmer. So, I mean, yeah, I understand that people are averse to the, or some people are averse to the cost of getting or certified as organic, but in my worldview, and maybe I'm very rigid, you know, it's organic, and then anything, there's really nothing else that has the credibility of the National Organic Standard. So there could be other certifications, but I don't really know what they are. And I mean, that's like a giant Pandora's box that probably, if you're super interested in it, I'd be happy to talk to you about it offline.
All right. Here's a good question. If neither commercial and nonprofit farmers make money, how can we subsidize farmers so we can retain them?
I mean, that is the million-dollar question, right? I mean, I think that's, yeah, this is the struggle of agriculture. You know, how do farmers make a living farming? So, I mean, Andy, you're a farmer, right? And you have an off-farm job. So, I mean, I think that I guess the bottom line is it's very difficult for farmers to make money, especially small scale diversified farmers. So there are some that make lots of money, so I don't want to like paint a picture of doom and gloom. I mean, I think you just hit the important question that people have been trying to answer for a really long time. I know that was a non-answer, but I'm just acknowledging the importance and the insight. And I guess it would be nice. I guess all I want to say to you is that there isn't really an easy solution.
And I think that plays into the role of organics as well and the true cost of food.
Right.
Okay. So here's hopefully something you can just recap, but do you consider community gardens as a part of urban agriculture, or is urban agriculture only a farm?
Well, I mean, I think that's a difficult question, right? And it kind of goes back to what is an urban farm. If an urban farm is about producing food and a living for a farmer, then a community garden, for the commercial market, let me put it that way, then a community garden is more about building community and maybe growing some food for home consumption. So they're definitely complementary activities. I don't know whether they're, I don't think they're the same. In my mind, they're not the same. But I don't think one is better than the other. I just think they're different.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question from Jennifer that I appreciate as someone who works with returning military veterans. Jennifer is asking, did you ask questions regarding diversity other than race, for example, disabilities?
No. No, I mean, again, this comes down to we have a limited number of questions we can ask people. And we started, I don't know, I'm sure that if you can remember, Andy, we had many more questions and we went back and forth, cutting things off, adding things here. So the problem with a survey is you never can really ask all of the important questions. You hope you just get the key essential ones so that you can do a decent analysis.
Okay, here's a question that says, the presentation and study focused on for-profit and nonprofit farming. This person is wondering if subsistence farming, farming for home consumption in the urban context, is that significant? If so, how?
Sure. So I guess the difference between a subsistence farm and a community garden is the community garden might be a shared plot. So, I mean, I think, and community garden and then subsistence farming, I guess I'm just interpreting that as people growing for their own consumption, but subsistence to me kind of implies that there's no other way to live, so that it's like a necessity more than a choice. So I guess I'm not 100% following the drift of the question, but I think if you take out my preconceived notion, which means that people are farming, subsistence farmers do so because that's the only way they can eat, and put them more into this community garden or growing for home consumption, I think it's definitely part of the same story. The difference is it doesn't really have like a social goal that extends beyond an individual family, or it doesn't have a like a profit-minded goal the way a traditional farm might have.
Uh-huh. And here's a great question from Gary again, which is closely related to our project, but I'll let you address it here. Do you have any sense of the biggest challenges reported by urban farmers?
Oh, well, that is in the survey, and I just haven't looked at it yet. So, and actually, if I read some of our collaborator Lydia's work a little more closely, we might actually know the answer to that. So, again, I think that's something you can follow up with us, and we can give you that information.
Right, and as a result too of the answers for the needs of urban farmers, through this project we are creating a deliverable, a toolkit that sort of addresses how to overcome some of the barriers, particularly related to the specific challenges addressed through this research.
Right.
Okay, do you feel operating a nonprofit farm is being used as a workaround by farms to deal with land costs in urbanized areas?
Well, if they're, let's see, that's a really interesting question. So I suppose if you're given, that would assume that if you're a nonprofit, someone can give you land to use. Yeah. I don't know if it's a workaround, but it's a very good solution. I like it. I mean, I think in the end, if you're a nonprofit, there are rules about what you can do with your profits. So I think, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there's something, I can't make the next leap, but I don't think it's a necessarily a workaround, but I think it's a good solution for the right farmer if you can find the right partner that's willing to let you farm on their land.
Mm-hmm. And Tim is asking a couple more questions about zoning. I'm not sure we can answer, but he is wondering, let's see, he says in his city, the parcels that are remnant of being zoned agriculture in the urban county tend to be marginal lands, often in public control and not suitable for a home, perhaps are in a floodplain. So I would say to that, feel free to contact us or through ATRA, and we can talk more a little about zoning as well. Let's see. Do you know of the most effective government or municipal policy changes that might move urban agriculture forward, such as taxes, sales outlets, incentives, provisions, labor incentives?
Well, I mean, I guess I would like to answer your question in a different way. So what do you exactly mean by moving urban agriculture forward? I mean, having more urban agriculture farms, making it possible for urban agriculture to maybe the farmers to make more money or to increase their standard of living. So, I mean, I think that understanding the purpose of the farm and what you think moving forward would be is an important part of what policies could actually make that happen. So, more information.
All right.
Please, yeah.
And here's a follow-up that I don't know if this exists, but we'll ask anyways. Gary is wondering if you know how many people have left urban farming.
Oh, so I mean, I guess this is a really hard question to answer, because when you think about someone leaving a rural farm, it's very concrete. It's like, I had a farm, it was in my family for 3 generations, and then I left, right? You can measure it. Here, the urban farming, because it's so fluid and dynamic, and often it's not really, it's like not owned in the same specific way that a rural farm would be. So are you asking how many people, you know, started an urban farm and then gave up in a year or two? I bet a lot of them. How many people worked on an urban farm as a volunteer and then no longer do? I bet that there's a lot of those people as well. So again, I think that these visions of what does it mean to enter or exit an urban farm is hard to answer because we don't really have a framework for analyzing what the farm is, what's the purpose of the farm, and like how it's established.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe we'll take one or two more here, but a lot of questions are coming in, which again we will be able to address in the next few days. But here's one that I think is quick to restate. Was 90% of the farms or 90 farms that made under $10,000?
90%.
90%. And here's a person asking also about whether we grasped any information regarding indoor production, greenhouse facilities, as related to farm viability.
Yes, we have that information, and when we do our deeper analysis of farm viability or farm profitability, we'll definitely be looking at those aspects because, well, as you know, if you're farming close to a city, those season extenders or greenhouses are really an important part of the farming operation.
Okay, well, I think we've tackled many questions, and I know you've got to get to class here, Dr. Dimitri, but we appreciate you sticking around and answering questions. There's quite a few more still coming in, so we'll be sure to follow up. And I just want to mention to please remember to take the short survey that will follow on your screen after the close of the webinar. And I want to thank you again, Dr.